All right, everybody, welcome back. Good old Mateus Moolah for a midday Friday edition. Interesting case of events. I was not planning on going live today. Technically, I should be on my laptop working at 5, but that opportunity arose for me to do a live stream. Palantir is also doing a live stream starting in about 10 minutes. And it's an interesting one. So I just released a video for those of you guys that are interested. I touched a little bit about the white paper that Sham had put together, talking a little bit about how we've sat on our laurels too much since the fall of the wall and allowed defense contractors really to get everybody up and not to get everybody up but really consolidate a lot of the industry. And with that, there's been more concentration on just collecting capital instead of actually collecting and actually innovating and creating new things that will continue to make us be the world superpower that we were, whether it was in World War II or whatever. So we're about 8 minutes away from the start of that. Appreciate everybody being here on a midday stream. The last thing that I want to do prior to getting us kicked off is really just look at the markets really quick. So let me just pull up. And if anybody has any questions prior to getting started about just life in general or anything of the like, be more than happy to answer it. But let's just run through some of our key things that we like to look at. So firstly, let's just take a quick look at good old Buttcorn, or Bitcoin, as some of us may call it. And let's zoom in, get a good view. Bitcoin hanging out just above 70,000. Let's look at good old Palantir. I know this was up today. We'll be talking a little bit more about this, obviously, in the coming 10 minutes. But $42.20, very interesting to see. Very curious to see what ends up happening once you get this live stream up and running in the next 8 minutes or so. If it continues to show more strength as we get into it. I know Rocket Lab was also up today. My portfolio was up nicely with the two positions. We're up 6%. So congrats to everybody. I'm kind of kicking myself because I wanted to purchase some leaps for 2027, and I didn't do that. I still should. So maybe after this live stream, when I get a moment, I will do that. Let's just take a quick look a little bit while we're going to be talking about it over the coming years. What's going on? So Lockheed, for example, is up 40 something percent over the last however many years. And since 2000 alone, it's up about 2,800%. So 28x. So that'll be interesting when we talk a little bit about that when we get into the call with Sham and them. And then same thing with what's going on here with General Dynamics. Let's just take a quick look. This is up 1,150%. So interesting to see what ends up showing up here as well. Very good. I'm trying to think what other companies. Check out the SPY. I know that this rebounded pretty well. This is at 573. It was in the 560s yesterday. So we're up $4.46. This is good for me. I have about 500 some shares. I'd like to get closer to 1,000, but we're still down a little bit comparatively to where we were earlier in the week. So curious to see what happens with that. Let's check out good old Shell. I sold this at about 72, 73 bucks. And this is down. So I'm curious if oil prices are down overall. Let's just take a quick opportunity to do a good look. Oil price and share this tab instead. Yes, good old oil prices, man. Good old oil prices are back below $70. OPEC lifts October production. There you go. That's probably why. 370,000 increase. So for those of you guys that have yet to become subscribers to the channel, not members, but subscribers, please be sure to do that. We do live streams intermittently for Rocket Lab. We do them for Palantir. We do them for a bunch of different things. And overall, just trying to keep the portfolio up and going to the right. Overall, things looking pretty good. Oh, another one that I wanted to look at as well before we get kicked off and we end up losing our trains of thought for what's going on in Palantir's world is Amazon. I haven't dove too much into the numbers, but the headline numbers that I did see were very promising. I'm happy with this um, being a Amazon shareholder. I think this will be the first $5 trillion company, if not one of the first. Obviously, there's a lot of other companies out there, maybe NVIDIA will get there first. You never necessarily know about some of these things, but I think it's going to be interesting overall. So anyway, man, let me just make sure before we get all this kicked off that I show this on Twitter and a bunch of other things. Live now, covering surprise, Palantir, defense, Reformation, live stream. And let me just do PLTR post. Very good. So hopefully we get a little bit of friends over from that. And yeah, I'm curious to see if any of you guys have any numbers. What are you guys thinking as well? Junebug, always good to see you. Mark, Dougie, what is going on? My guy, Francisco, you're the man, the myth, and legend. Jean, what's going on? Florin Tube, what is up? My guy. Miss Lisa, as always, great to see you. Jeremy, what is going on, my guy? Juan Carlos, buenos tardes, mi amigo. Como se dice? Let's get rich. Just kidding. Francisco, you're the man. Yes, Matt. I need to know what you think about Apple Globalstar deal today. Can be big news for Rocket Lab. Of course, of course, of course, of course. ET FaceTime home, my guy, my guy. What is going on, Ray? Thank you for the continued support, man. Appreciate you more than ever. The Globalstar deal, man. Yeah, let's just take a quick look at that. We got 3 minutes prior to this bad boy jumping off here at Palantir. But for those of you guys that don't necessarily know much about the Globalstar deal, let me just type in Globalstar Rocket Lab. Yep. So back in the day, I think it's pretty interesting. Globalstar gets contracted to do this work for Apple to put up a bunch of satellites, help with their constellation. Globalstar then subcontracts out to MDA. MDA then subcontracts out part of it to Rocket Lab. So what does that mean? So let's zoom in. In February 2022, Rocket Lab was awarded $143 million subcontract to the MDA to lead the design and manufacture of 17 spacecraft buses. So basically like the big bulk of it. For Globalstar's new low Earth orbit satellites for Apple, basically. They'll lead the development of the spacecraft buses while MDA will act as the prime contractor to manufacture the satellites. So to me, I think it's interesting. I'm not exactly sure how MDA was able to really contribute to this from what it looked like. It was mostly Rocket Lab doing the majority of the work. So if there's talks of another constellation, then if that's the case, then, Rocket Lab will probably be in the top running for that. Hello from Greece, man. I didn't know I had Greece followers. Thank you for letting me know and showing up. Juan Carlos, vamos a hacer mil. I guess that means hacernos. Hacernos? I think that, what does that mean? Let's get rich. Let's get to 1 million. Vamos, let's get to 1 million, I'm assuming. Let's get to 1 million. That's what I'm assuming it's what it is. I think Harris should win. L3 Harris? Just kidding. I know what you're talking about. Now, don't think L3 Harris will win the Rocket Lab deal. You know what I'm saying? What is going on? All right, so let's just get this up and shared. I don't want to miss anything of it. Let me get it on the other screen. Currently, we have 97 people. I'm surprised. Maybe I wouldn't be surprised if some of you guys go to if there ends up being like a surprise stream by Amit or something like that. I don't get upset if you guys run over to there. He's a lot better about these live streams than I am. There's a lot more what's the word I'm looking for? A lot more
Thank you for joining us today. I'm Sham Sankar, CTO of Palantir Technologies, and I've gathered a group here with me to discuss the 18 theses of how we can resurrect the American industrial base. I think it should be no surprise to anyone who's been paying attention that we are in a state of undeclared emergencies. We've had a pogrom in Israel where 1,200 people have been slaughtered. We had a North Korean ballistic missile launch yesterday. We have ballistic missiles raining down on our allies. We now have North Korean troops fighting in Ukraine. We have the Russians providing exquisite targeting intel to the Houthis to hold 15% of global trade hostage. Counterfactually, it's hard to understand what more we would need to see to believe that the world is actually descending into chaos here. And given the trillions of dollars that we've spent on our national security over the last 30 years since the end of the Cold War, it'd be reasonable to wonder what went wrong. And one of the most profound problems that I really see is that we had a great schism at the end of the Cold War between commercial innovation and defense innovation. When the Berlin Wall was still standing, only 6% of defense spending on major weapon systems went to defense exquisite companies. 94% of it went to what I call dual purpose companies. We forget that in our lifetime, Chrysler built cars and missiles. Ford built satellites until 1990. General Mills, the cereal company, built artillery. Every car, camera, and cereal box that Americans bought enhanced our national security. Today, it could not be more different. Now, from 6%, 86% of defense spending goes to defense exquisite companies, a group of companies that have slowly and gradually been put on Galapagos Islands that cannot actually compete in the American market, in the commercial market, and we're seeing that. And when we look back to our history, the industrial base that won World War II, that won the Cold War, it was not a defense industrial base. It was, in fact, an American industrial base. And unfortunately, that is exactly what our main adversary, our peer competitor, not near peer, is doing. If you look at the Chinese primes, only 20% of their revenue comes from the PLA. The rest comes from us buying cheap shit on Amazon. Our neighbors, we are collectively subsidizing lethality against US service members here. They are using our playbook. But we can fix all this. And so to have a robust discussion on all these topics, I have with me Bill Greenwald, Terra Authority, and the illustrious former Congressman Mike Gallagher. Maybe I can turn it over to Bill to kick us off to talk about competition and how that's changed over the last 3 decades or 5 decades, really, and the sort of industrial base and the practices of the DoD that we now have.
Sure, no, happy to do that. How we got here, I mean, really, when we're talking about is the defense industrial base bankruptcy. And I think Hemingway had a nice discussion on one of his characters, which is, how did you go bankrupt? And 2 ways, gradually and suddenly. Well, gradually it happened, and it started really in the 1960s. And suddenly, I think we're now seeing that today. America, in World War II and the early Cold War, was an amazing, innovative machine, and DoD was one of the drivers behind that. And it's just one of those things to why was that the case? It was because there was competition among services, competition among programs, competition among companies. The industrial base, as you mentioned, was highly integrated, what we would later call civil military integration, but primarily commercial companies working for defense on behalf of the taxpayer. And during that time, we also had an innovation structure designed around serial operational prototyping that was competitive, that was the best of came out and succeeded. And we did things in a massive amount of limited amount of time, with resources that were essentially constrained, but still focused on time. And what were the results? The first ICBM, the first satellite launch, the first jet aircraft, the first nuclear carrier, the first nuclear submarine, all developed within less than 5 years. And then something happened. And what was that? And it was kind of, I'm going to refer to it as fear and hubris, in a sense that, Sputnik came around in 1958. The country had this collective uncertainty of whether the system was actually working. And there were those who said, I've got an answer. And the answer was centralized planning. It was, the Soviets are beating us, therefore, if we adopt this, we can then compete against them. And so a number of management processes that were then embedded in the auto industry at the time, which frankly could have sold anything at any time because there was really no competition in that industry, brought centralized planning, linear in processes, and it was married up to the Rand Corporation's idea on systems analysis, which is all driven by cost. And so what did we get? We got a lot of processes. So we got centralized planning, we got the PPBE process, the budget process. We ended up with a requirements process that had to happen before you could actually get any money. We had a long acquisition process that took 10 to 15 years to get anything. And eventually we became the Soviets. And then, when the Cold War ended, we never got rid of that. Now,
Hmm.
one can argue, well, we won with that. Why should we change? Well, we won because the underlying economy, which was the commercial side, was driving so much wealth that we could outspend the Soviets in the same type of management practices. We can't do that now with China. And I think we have to take some major changes. So how do we improve that? Well, we should try to bring in, we should tack those processes. We should bring in competition. We should look to those individuals in the department that can drive new requirements immediately, like the combatant commanders. And so I think there are a lot of different ways we can approach the subject.
Well, that's great. I mean, often when people talk about competition, they're really focused on the competition within the defense industrial base. And while absolutely, let's have more of that, I feel like the greatest issue is actually the lack of competition within government itself. That we used to have multiple aircraft programs that were essentially competing with each other, and these were fierce competition. When we were building the ICBM, we had the Army, Air Force, and Navy each trying to go win that work and prove and compete against each other. It was Zumwalt who said that the Navy has three enemies: the USSR, the Air Force, and Hyman Rickover. So it tells you really how the institutions thought about who and what they were competing against. They're competing against their own services, they're competing against other services, and ultimately we're competing against the enemy.
Hmm.
Yeah, somewhere along the line, again, when we adopted the idea that the central planners in CAPE and PA&E equivalent and in the acquisition bureaucracy could pick and choose that one line of effort and prematurely cut off competition, after a concept development phase, and pick a contractor and pick a service and move forward. When you had that mindset, you lost what those type of competitions, and we started creating these myths around inter-service competition, and inter-program competition was bad. It was duplicative. It was wasteful. It was inter-service rivalry was a bad thing, and therefore competition is a bad thing unless we define competition as the way we want to define it.
Right.
And so we lost all of that. And so how do you bring that back? Well, and certain technologies, I think you can. Each of the services pursuing drone technology. Each of the services pursuing different ways of getting communications to the troops. Now the question is whether they develop their own bespoke solution or they can develop solutions and competing that can be applied, agency-wide. We'll see how that works.
That's one area where competition does happen in government, unfortunately, not in a productive way where you have competition of different parts, such as services competing for a better program, but the government competing with the private sector. And that you hit the nail on the head, Bill, when you said create a bespoke solution. So we see there's almost latent competitive nature in DoD, and we see it come out when either the government says, we have run some pilots, we've seen great innovation, thanks commercial sector, we'll take it from here and build it ourselves. Or they turn to an FFRDC and say, you have this insider level understanding, you can just create this capability. Not supposed to be the way competition is manifesting, but we see it all the time.
Before we go, first of all, I completely agree with that. And also, I'm honored to be here in such august company. Sean, thank you for your contribution to the debate. Tara, I remember when we first met, I think at Reagan National Defense Forum, like 8 years ago. We were at a dinner. I thought, how is this person so smart and younger than me? And I felt very nervous at the time. And then, Bill, I've been stealing your ideas and instantiating them into legislation for years now. I just want take a step back and foot stomp a bigger issue that I think, Bill, you alluded to, like, which was true throughout the old Cold War, right? Aaron Freberg actually makes this point in a great book called In the Shadow of the Garrison State, where he said basically, like,
So to give some context, Mike used to be a senator or within the House of Representatives, and now he's joined Palantir as head of defense.
ingredient for why we won, because we were able to retain sort of that bottom up innovative mindset. At the same time, the Pentagon pursued more of the top down approach. And similarly, I think, like, since the end of the Cold War, we have, like, what has changed since then is not only lacking, like, the sense that we are in an existential competition, but the web of regulation, the ossification of the defense industrial base has kind of undermined that foundation of strength, which is the bottom up innovative spirit. And really, I think the willingness to take intelligent risks. I thought about this a lot as a member of the Armed Services Committee for 8 years, because oftentimes I felt like why would someone in the Pentagon take a real risk? Because they would fear getting hauled in front of Congress and being punished for failure. Finding a way to sort of, like, celebrate original mistakes again is a key part culturally of fixing this bigger problem.
I think something else that going back to that history is that whenever we did succeed post 1960 with a program or a technology, we took that program or technology outside of this ossified system.
Yeah.
Whether it was stealth, whether it was PGMs, whether it was how Bill Perry did things, whether what we did with NRAPs. I mean, we took it outside the system, or we turned to commercial tech and tried to create new competition.
Yeah.
And that's something that Congress has been trying to do since 1994 to bring in new competition to break up the monopolies and so on.
But that's the other frustrating part of the debate, because I feel like the perspective of Congress is, at least for the last decade, you have plenty of members of Congress out there saying, we need more innovation. We need to, like, Mike Brown's commercial fast follower strategy to help. Every year at Reagan, it's like someone gives a speech about we need to help more companies cross the valley of death. And then we go a step further and we give the Pentagon authorities to experiment, and then nothing actually happens
because they're outside of the system.
Yeah.
We have so many raiders and tech incubators and other funds that I can't rattle off the top of my head because there are so many of them I've lost count and track, and they're all outside of the system. And so we have two forces that are happening. Exactly like you said, this process has blown up over the years, which continues to push commercial companies out of having any interest in working with DoD. And simultaneously, we're creating more and more different funds to try and address the problem that are outside of the system. Instead of someone standing up and saying, enough already, let's fix the system.
And I think that speaks to one of the things I think a lot about is that the monopsony is the root of the pathology that ails us here. So, why are we not willing to break the system? Why are we not able to leverage the authorities, the innovators? Because we centralize the buying. We would prefer a joint program office rather than the competition within government that we used to have before. And experientially, I'd say nobody really wakes up making radically different decisions on their program to deal with a threat a year or two from now with China. But they do wake up empirically. We see this every day to compete with the bureaucrat one corridor down the hall from them.
Well, I think part of the reason that there's a joint program office approach and a fear of competition within the government is because there's a perception that we can't afford it. We can't afford to have multiple services compete for these exquisite capabilities, except the fallacy there is the competition could drive the price down.
And often does. It comes down to what's your view on technology. Is technology supposed to make things better, faster, cheaper, or is technology an expense? And this is one of the greatest paradoxes I see between commercial and defense. In the commercial world, people are expensive and technology is cheap. And you're trying to figure out how do I adopt as much technology as possible to gain competitive advantage. In government, people are viewed as abundant. The billets are fixed. It's not going to really change. And people are the way to solve every problem. And technology is unaffordable. We shouldn't be investing in technology.
Bill, just on the point, I mean, to what extent?
It's an interesting thought.
This sort of what I would call like a fetishization of jointness, is that like an unintended consequence of Goldwater-Nichols? And will it require true Goldwater-Nichols reform in order to get at that? Because I view this as one of two things I failed to get done during my time in Congress. The other being the Fires Act, which I stole from you. We can go into that later. But There's never a good time. It's like BRAC, right? There's never a good time to do a comprehensive review of Goldwater Nichols or DOTMA, by the way.
I think, yes, the Joint Program Office is kind of going to the idea that it's, doing multiple things is wasteful, but also I think there's some institutional issues there. But I think, in the interim, before you have, large scale review of that, I think if you gave the combatant commanders a pot of money, as Sham was proposing, that could spur a lot of competition and a lot of changes. And frankly, if they've only have a small amount of money, they may not like a joint program office. They might want to say, I want the Marines to do that.
Yeah.
Or I really want, the Navy actually is. So I think we've evolved to this idea because the overseers think that, again, centralized planning is the way to go, and therefore a centralized joint program office is terrific. I think if GAO were to go out and audit the venture capital community in Silicon Valley, it would recommend kind of destroying all innovation because it's not efficient. Well, of course it's not efficient. It's chaotic. It's an anarchy. But it delivers incredible innovation, and that's what the Department of Defense once did, but no longer can because it's adopted a different model.
I mean, I think you really hit the nail on the head there, which comes out like, what are venture capitalists investing in? Fundamentally, at the beginning, they're investing in talent. You're deciding there's no product, there's nothing to show. You're trying to assess whether you have world-class talent to go after this problem. And I feel like at some point in the past, we got that joke. Whether we think about it as Northrop Grumman today, but it was really Leroy Grumman and Jack Northrop. It was Glenn Martin, not Lockheed Martin. It was Howard Hughes and Henry Kaiser. And inside of government, it was John Boyd and Hyman Rickover, people who were very abrasive, that were very difficult to deal with, but were right. And we had the primacy of winning built around that. So I think a theory of change here is not let's reform the process to then pray at a different ultra of process. It's really let's find the hard-headed humans who are exceptionally talented, who are going to go through almost like kamikazes and get this done. And if we really look at the litany of great Americans who have delivered this chaotic innovation, in their lifetimes, they were really not that appreciated. And I think stealing yourself, we could try to reform that or not, but I'm not sure that's the most important factor. It's more about how do we find these people, empower them. Congress has a role here. Without Congress protecting Rickover, that wouldn't have worked. And in fairness to that story, there's also a period of time where Congress needed to stop protecting Rickover.
That's right.
Like all of these innovators will have a lifespan.
Yeah, that's interesting. I feel like we learned that lesson during 2 years of war in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? Like the hard way. And this was a Petraeus-ism. Like he would always say, like rank is nothing, talent is everything, right? And there's a way in which like the crucible of war forces innovation, and that could be like that could manifest itself in the decision to like promote a truly smart lance corporal or captain, but also all the way up to the level of Secretary of Defense, where you have Bob Gates waging war on his own bureaucracy in order to deliver the MRAP. And the fact that it takes the Secretary of Defense to do something like that, which I think is still true today for most major decisions, is itself a reflection on how broken the building is. But for whatever reason, like it's a lesson we have to keep learning. And the fundamental challenge is learning it and implementing it prior to a war breaking out. Like the paradox I always come back to in the present day is how do you put the Pentagon on a war footing in order to prevent war? Very difficult in a free society such as ours, where traditionally we think of our gift as crisis response, not crisis avoidance.
We need urgency in the department.
Yeah.
And I don't know how you create that. Certainly part of it is leadership. It's interesting that you mentioned Bob Gates because you think about his tenure. Tenure is a huge part of this. If we want leaders and heads of programs and heads of services to be founder-like and builders, they need more than 2 years at a time to do it.
I also think there's some lessons learned in, in that urgency in wartime, to transfer it into a peacetime or pre-war time, or you'd think now we'd be having that sense of urgency, but regardless, there needs to be a number of artificial constraints on time, because in wartime, it's essentially how fast can you do something. If you're not in war, it's like, we have all the time in the world. Yeah. So you have to put some kind of artificial constraints on whether the money or decision time or whatever, and start competing different solutions during that time. And that's very similar to the VC world. I mean, if you don't survive, and what you're going to do from the transition to A and B round, well, you're not going to get a B round.
Yeah.
All right, you're done. And we don't have that. And there's a certain amount of time you get the money and a certain amount of time you can do.
So
And
this
we
is
don't
what
have that.
Congress can do. Congress can turn off DoD spending if they don't get this figured out.
Well, by individual.
Oh, they do that every year.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, yeah. What was that Secretary Spencer's thing with Navy shipbuilding? It's like, I forget what year it was. 2018. He's like, yeah, we just put $4 billion in a trash can and we lit it on fire due to continuing resolutions.
Yeah.
Congress is a massive part of the problem. I'm happy to talk about my view on authorizing an appropriations committee, but it might distract. We can come back to it. Sean, I'm just curious before we forget about this point. Your proposal on giving the combatant commands a greater share of money to play around with. Like, if you were to steelman the best counter argument for that you've encountered since you put it out there, what is it? And then how would you counter the counter argument?
The best counter argument is like, well, they're focused on the fight tonight. How are they going to sustain things over long periods of time? And there's a lot of truth to that, I think. But
Sean's a peach vibe kind of guy.
Who's doing the 0 to 1?
Okay.
And who's doing the 1 to N? These are modally very different. They require very different personalities. By the way, I've at Palantir over 20 years now. I've transitioned probably 10 things through that. That is its own valley of death. And those valleys of death are always hard. There is no process to get from one side to the other. It is interpersonally very frictionful, and people try to avoid it. I think this is one of the root causes of pathology. We see how chaotic and messy that is, and we try to make it less painful with process, but in so doing, we make it not work. Now, my counter argument to that is there's not enough 0 to 1 happening. So you want an artificial constraint on time? Competition is one of those you're going to go faster because there's an alternative that the military or a combatant commander could be using if you don't go faster. It's your motivation to adopt things that work today instead of conducting science projects. It is what tethers you to operating in the world as it is, not the world that you wish existed. Mm-hmm. And I think this is actually really important. So I was going to say my maybe slightly contrarian idea on, it took Bob Gates as Secretary of Defense to lead MRAP. Maybe it's always going to take that. Maybe it's not a symptom of the brokenness of bureaucracy. It's a symptom of our brokenness of our mindset to believe that a faceless machine and process could deliver those sorts of outcomes. It's always going to take the will of individual leaders.
Go ahead, sorry.
I was going to say the last part of this is you see this coming back in the zeitgeist with Paul Graham's founder mode, right? And I feel like the greatest mistakes I've ever made at Palantir are operating in manager mode, thinking that you could just hire outside expertise, thinking that somewhere out there the answer existed and it would just be facile and easy to plug it in and follow someone else's playbook and it would just work. And every time I've done that, it's blown up in my face. It does not work. I deeply believe in the concept of founder mode. I'm not a literal founder, but this idea of that extreme sense of ownership, the idea that you have to think these things through first principles, and it requires your will in order to manifest the reality.
Essentially, I think manager mode would counsel Sham, don't spend time writing a treatise on. By the way, I'm here, I think, as a token Catholic to defend the faith
Not
against
at
your
all.
attack.
Murphy,
Okay,
Doherty,
good.
come
all right,
on.
perfect. Good. But it conveys a sense of mission commitment that I actually think is inspiring for the organization. I agree, and this was the most unsatisfying conclusion to reach for someone whose general view of the world is that the legislative branch should be the dominant branch of government, and the fundamental cancer in our Constitution is that we've surrendered our power to the executive. But when it comes to defense and true reform, I have concluded that it will require a talented Secretary of Defense with the backing of the president, by the way, and willing to expend political capital with very talented service secretaries that are all mission aligned, doing that. And that's not just the story of Gates. That's, I would argue, is how we got a near 600 ship Navy in the 1980s, right? It required a very talented SecNav in the form of laymen in order to overrule a lot of admirals, often going to war with Rickover himself, to your earlier point. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
I would say we saw that with Ash Carter, too, to some extent. And same thing. I mean, an unbelievable man who accomplished a lot in the department, certainly DIU being a great legacy of that. Very frictionful personality, but it was necessary. If you're going to drive things through the board, you had to push and be willing to break a few things.
Yeah,
I think it also is going to require, not just leadership and DoD focus, but again, with the president, we have to focus on the whole of country effort here and the whole of our economy and bringing in commercial companies that now refuse to do business with the Department of Defense.
Yeah.
And we need their intellectual capital. We need them working on our problems. We need them to be able to come in and out of this area. And then the next level is, well, we're a country of 350 million. That's pretty large. We've got a lot of scale here, but we're competing as a country that has 1.4 billion people with all the potential in scale that's available there. Therefore, we probably need to work closer with some of our allies, whether it's NATO allies or in Asia or wherever, to get that scale back. But that requires doing exactly the same thing. We have to focus on their commercial market, focus on their dev, and frankly, they're not as even far ahead as we are.
But even where that should be easy, right? Like, let's look at our closest allies with whom we share very sensitive intelligence, the Aussies and the Brits. Listen, I give the Biden administration a lot of credit for the AUKUS agreement, but the AUKUS agreement is like on life support right now. And part of that is Pillar 1, because we can't build enough subs, because our shipbuilding industrial base is very challenged right now. But even on Pillar 2, which is where we're supposed to cooperate on advanced technology, whether it's hypersonic defense or cyber, or take your pick, we still have barriers to collaboration with the Aussies and the Brits in the form of outdated ITAR regulation. Now, Congress has made some stride in reforming those, but we need to, we incorporated Australia into our national technology industrial base back in 2017 or 2018.
Yep.
In no meaningful sense is Australia part of our national technology industrial base. And if we can't do it with the Aussies, like, who are we going to do it with? Yeah, but you're totally right. The only way we compete economic and technologically against a country like China is we have to build kind of a free world ecosystem that's easier to pool resources.
It's very, on ITAR is just another one of those processes like the budget and so on, where we've decided to kill innovation.
That's right.
And it's, it's a 1970s process. And we came around the idea that, well, we've done all this wonderful innovation. Let's kind of shut it down and make sure we don't, we don't share with anybody. But the reality is we've essentially have unilaterally disarmed ever since there, because we've been making it very difficult for commercial companies or wherever to work for us based on
It's also where congressional oversight contributes to the problem, because ITAR is shared between state, defense, and therefore oversight is shared between HASC, HACD, and HVAC, right? Like, and then also the Senate gets a vote, I guess, sometimes.
Well, this is a little bit of a weedy point, but I think it's quite substantive. One of my theories is that all the value accretes in the seams between teams. So like when you're running an institution,
no real impact to the stock price while this is going on, by the way.
And succeeds. Where they get caught is where you actually need multiple teams, where there are seams between them to start coordinating. And that coordination complexity becomes very high. The sort of static nature of our bureaucracies means that those seams don't change very often. The first thing I look at when I have a problem internally is, can I collapse these teams together? Do I actually need to divide these teams up into more discrete parts? Like, there is something healthy about continuously reorganizing around the problem. It allows you to focus on the primacy of the outcome. If you're going to pass something like AUKUS, why do you think it's going to work if you're not literally reorganizing your institution around making that work? It's not going to work.
Yeah.
You're going to die at the seams.
Yeah. And what we've done over the course of decades is empower those seams or empower those stovepipes, whether it's contracting, we separate them out and we empower them to do their thing, or whether it's the security bureaucracy to do that, or whether it's the testing bureaucracy. And each one of those is judged on what they do in their particular area, but not as far as for the totality of the mission.
These structural challenges tie exactly into what you were just saying, Bill, too, about being able to attract in the commercial sector. We've seen over the past 5+ years now that there's been a big influx of companies willing to work with defense. There's been a huge influx of venture capital to fund it. I worry about the staying power, because for all of the issues that we're surfacing, there's also no lack of recommendations of actionable things that Congress could do, the executive branch could do, the president could take leadership on. We know what the reforms are. Where's the political will and leadership to implement them, to change these structures so you get the international cooperation? It's not just ITAR, it's overclassification and the fact that secret, no foreign is the default standard for everything. So forget the seams, you can't even talk to the different teams. And the classification stems into the commercial sector challenges as well. It becomes a massive chicken and egg problem where you require what is required to work with the government, you have to have a priori. Well, some of that is possible with enough capital to go out and get, and some of it's just not.
Yeah.
I'm glad you brought up the structural issues, because the one that, of course, is the one I think the most about is the corrosive effects of cost plus contracting. And
Can we just agree that cost plus contracts are the papal indulgences of our system?
I love
It
it.
is
Yes.
paying off entrenched interests
Yes.
to allow for bad behavior.
You got to edit
There's
the
the
document now,
Catholicism
Sean.
show.
That's great. I love it. I love it.
Sorry to interrupt,
The
Sean, but
church fights
that's
back.
what it is.
You know, Eric Lofgren was telling me, like, look, I think actually a lot of these pathologies started before the Last Supper. It wasn't just the peace dividend. You could say that was the moment where you went bankrupt all at once, but we were going bankrupt slowly before then. In the 70s and 80s, there were many boardroom conversations by dual purpose companies of how do we get out of the defense business? How do we sell this off?
Yeah.
Why is that happening? Because you only have one customer, the monopsony, and they're not a great customer. And they're not really thinking very hard about what are your incentives and how do I get what I want out of this? It's not a giveaway. It's really like, what do I need for national security? What does the country expect of me? How do I make sure my supplier base is going to be able to deliver that innovation and that capability to me? And I don't envy the job of being a monopsonist. It's very, very hard, which is why I think you need to try to approximate free market mechanisms to offload that creativity, that chaos that you need. You know, I don't think any of us as an individual could have come up with the requirements for the iPhone. Thank God we have Steve Jobs roaming around there and providing that. Now, one of the things about cost plus is I think if you were to steel man, well, why do you need cost plus? It's like, well, how do we make sure people get, they're not extracting money from the government? It's a fair amount. There's lots of risk. We don't know what we want. We want optionality. But I think one of the challenges, it's fundamentally short on innovation. If you believe in innovation, you need an incentive to make things better, faster, cheaper, and exponentially. If you only thought things could get 10% better, I don't know, maybe cost plus is fine. But if you think things get 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times better, it's a disaster. You'll never unlock it. And I saw this recent analysis by CSIS that I thought was very powerful about the drop in space launch costs.
Yeah.
You know, space launch used to cost us roughly $20,000 to $50,000 for the shuttle, which, I grew up in the shadow of the Space Coast, very close to my heart. Used to wake up Saturday mornings to the double sonic booms, get ready to watch cartoons. But now Elon with Starship Heavy Reuse is going to bring that down to $10 to $20 per kilogram. That is more than 1,000x cost decrease. And if we had locked it up in the same old suppliers, the same old ULA approach where we're using Russian engines, like we would be stuck. And I think we underestimate the degree to which cost plus locks us into the past. And firm fixed price is the requisite incentive to push private industry to go raise pools of capital, let investors do the diligence and do I believe in your innovative approach? Yes, it could fail, but private capital is taking the risk and get after that. As Jeff Bezos said, your margin is my opportunity. It's the $50,000 coming down to 10 that has created the opportunity for SpaceX. And now people look at their success and kind of resent it and say, oh, we were only going to have one option. You have one option that's now 1,000 times cheaper than your prior one option that barely
And more
worked.
capable.
Yes.
And more capable. I think this is so important because I fear there is a perception within the department that the anti-cost plus argument
Just want to
is
share
about what's good for
this
businesses.
briefly.
Sure,
So this is what they're talking about, how things have kind of been flat from the 60s to the early 2000s. And then once SpaceX comes in, that's when you started seeing things really get wild in that respect.
the most capable outcome in the fastest possible time. That's exactly how we operate as innovative companies. It's exactly what DoD should be incentivizing.
So is the fix just a general fatwa, to bring another Abrahamic faith analogy, against cost plus contracting, or what's the fix on that?
I think so. I think cost plus should be a last resort, and I might go as far as to say that an extremely last resort. The other fix is just to honor the law, the FASA, the Federal Acquisition Streamlining Act. We already have in law the requirement that if a commercial item exists, you have to buy it if it meets your requirement. Actually, it's a very strong law. It has a 3-part test. If a commercial item exists that meets your requirement, you have no choice. You're not allowed to do developmental. You must buy it. If it doesn't exist, you must see if you can modify your requirements to match commercial items that do exist. If that's not possible, you must see if the commercial provider will modify their product to meet your requirements. Then and only then are you allowed to go developmental. That is the most violated law on the books because it plays to the very natural fetish that engineers have. It's a little emasculating not to be able to build things for yourself. So the engineers on the other end always want to go build these things.
Mm-hmm.
There is a pride of ownership. And I recognize that as it's not government. It's actually just human. Like I have that with my engineers. I see that with my commercial customers. There is a desire to build. And it is only the brutal reality of the primacy of winning. Oh, if we do this, it's going to cost us billions more, and we're going to be slow, and our competitors are going to crush us.
Yeah.
That gets them to make pragmatic decisions.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a congressional corollary to that, just quickly, Bill, sorry, which is like someone should be doing an annual or quarterly hearing, like highlighting all the FAFSA violations, or there'd be some way to like enhance the enforceability. I would guarantee your average member of Congress does not even know that that law is on the books and being violated on a day-to-day.
And the other important thing about commercial items is they're fixed price. I mean, in law, they're fixed price. And so that's what this whole fixed price cost plus is actually a battle between traditional ways of doing business and commercial ways of doing business. Fixed price cost. So we could just say, you want to do this commercially, or do you want to do this, the way we do it as the government always has, or at least recently. So.
And if I was going to steel man the other argument, it's like, well, a lot of these commercial items don't do everything I need. I might need to stitch together a handful of them. I think that is actually a consequence of the great schism of commercial and defense innovation. That might be true if you go to some of the largest technology companies where you're a rounding error. The US government is less than 1% of NVIDIA's revenue. If you want to influence NVIDIA, you can kind of see you're starting in a very bad sort of spot to begin with. You compare that to when Intel was first building integrated circuits in the late 60s, the Apollo program was 95% of Intel's revenue. It's clearly not anymore, but that's the bootstrapping. So if you actually have an American industrial base, I think you're going to see very different incentives. You're going to find commercial companies leaning in to pass all three parts of that test. Like, yeah, I will modify my commercial item on a commercial basis. I'm going to learn something from here that I can use elsewhere. I'm not even going to charge you for that R&D. It's just part of the firm fixed price that I'm giving.
Yeah.
The other set of thinking that leads people down the cost plus path that we see all the time is, well, I don't have a perfect understanding of the end outcome. This is so emergent from a capability perspective. We don't know exactly what those final requirements are. And so we've got to pay you along the way to do it. And I think it demonstrates the fact that one of the byproducts of the Great Schism was also a big breakdown in trust between DoD and the commercial sector, because a great way to navigate that kind of uncertainty in truly emergent technologies, but while working under firm fixed price constructs, because you're leveraging as much that exists in commercial already and trying to capture that commercial innovation.
I will say,
What's
whoever's
not
mic is
where it exists in the
dragging
United States
out of
these
these
days
four
is to bring your
is starting to
partners in
piss
and let
me
them
off.
figure it out with you along the way. You hire the companies with the 100x engineers. You don't tell them what the perfect end state is. You tell them what your problem is, because what they're exceptional at is solving it at speed.
And that's our the government's issue is, I want exactitude in requirements. I want exactitude in cost. I want exactitude in schedule. And the reality is, what we need are broad problem statements, or even specific problem statements, but doesn't take the solution and say you need that solution, because we can solve these.
Right. Look at the Sentinel missile program. Had all of those things that you just described, exactitude across the board. And the second it went into actual program status, all of that went out the window.
This is what I love about the story of how we built submarine-launched ballistic missiles in the 60s. Admiral Rayborn was leading that effort. And everyone wanted exactitude on cost and schedule and all this stuff. And he used the latest in decision analysis and science techniques. He did Monte Carlo simulation. He made the Gantt chart of Gantt charts. It was called PERT, P-E-R-T, and it was a total smokescreen. What he was really doing is giving the overseers a piece of paper that they could hold on to, they could sleep comfortably at night. But he was shielding the engineers to the messy, creative, completely unpredictable process that ultimately delivered the solution. And he was doing it with 4 competing programs underneath the hood here. And so I think the exactitude is it's not actually possible. We have to kind of like lean into the reality of what works here.
Sean, that gives me an idea. So speaking of sea-launched cruise missiles, in this case, we all know that DoD has a new variant to create the nuclear version. And right now the Navy is trying to figure out, do you use the TLAM body as a starting point, or do you use LRSO as a starting point? Well, what if, number one, you created competing programs, and number two, you add in a third variant, which is buy commercial cruise missile.
See what happens.
I love this.
Yeah.
We can test the competing program
Exactly.
right now.
And they're right at the beginning of the program life. They actually could do this, or maybe Congress has to tell them to. But
one of the things that I think also hurts us here quite a bit is, we focus on the speed of the delivery of the programs, but the rate limiter upstream of that is the fiscal agility that we do not have.
Yeah.
You know, it took me years. You know, when we started at Palantir, we knew nothing about government, knew nothing about I didn't know any of these acronyms. POM. The idea that it was going to take you 2 years to program money for a new start, like you can't survive that. You know, and we existed in a time before there was any defense innovation ecosystem to give you little tidbits to survive along the way. But we've tried to plug that hole by giving you stopgap solutions instead of saying, you know what, it is actually bonkers that it would take that long to find money.
Yeah.
We need fiscal agility. That means we can find money in days, maybe weeks. We should aspire for that, not years. And that we understand deeply in military doctrine that, you know, plans are useless and planning is invaluable. Well, a budget is a plan. The president's budget is a plan. Why would you think it's not going to, you know, it's going to survive first contact? You should be iterating on that plan every single day. The only thing you know about that plan is it's wrong.
This is what led me to the Fires Act, because when Bill, sincerely, I feel like this is a hopeful tale for those who are toiling away at think tanks around Washington D.C. Like, if your work is good, people will read it. The 10 members of Congress who can actually read will read it. But Bill was just sort of pointing out the fact that every year, money that has been appropriated for the Department of Defense goes unspent. And then it goes into abeyance in the Treasury for like 5 years, and then it disappears. So I thought that was crazy, and I reached out to Bill, and so we developed this construct where, imagine if you gave DoD the authority, by the way, that many other civilian agencies have, to reprogram money in a flexible way. You know, to pass a lot of money that, by some estimates, I think your estimate was over 10-ish years, $125 billion have been lost, evaporated. Imagine what we could do with $125 billion. I could prevent World War III with $125 billion. I'm confident. If you gave me like flexible money and some political backing from the White House, like that, I could do it. Less than that, probably. I could do it for $10 billion a year over the next 5 years. That's a big boast I'm realizing right now. But the idea was to just allow them to use the money that had already been appropriated, in this case for long-range precision fires and things that are in the unfunded requirement list in the Indo-Pacific. But Bill, I don't know if your thinking has evolved on that at all, or
No, I mean the issue of not having a flexible pot of money that the Secretary of Defense can use to essentially get things moving is just one of the main problems with the department's budgeting system. And you know, the PPB Commission was created to kind of talk about some of these things, and frankly, they you know, they did some I think some good work, but didn't really focus on the fact that, yeah, give the Secretary $10 billion, and you're going to see great things happening.
Yeah.
And give the combatant commanders dollars, and you're going to see great things happening. You know, you're going to see some things where great things didn't happen, but that's
right.
That's
Yeah.
you know,
We already have that.
this is
One-
messy. You know?
$1 billion of that should be a complete freaking failure, and then we should celebrate it. Like,
Yeah.
it should be a great original mistake.
Particularly if they were shooting on some pretty you know, high goals.
That's right. Yeah, and you think about like why don't we have containerized fires throughout the Indo-Pacific right now, the first and second island chain? By the way, we should just have containers that don't have fires in them, just to like freak the PLA planners out. Like, there's so many things you could do on a short period of time where you're not waiting for a Columbia-class sub to arrive in the Pacific in 2036 or something, right? That could just enhance near-term deterrence and get us to the 2030s where we're fighting on far more favorable ground relative to China that we're just not doing.
It seems like making more colors of money know your money
Yeah.
would help dramatically in this regard.
Yeah.
Again, in the category of things that could be done today, could be implemented today, that would create ultimately the $10 billion fund the SecDef needs to say, here's the important thing.
Yeah.
Go run 3 experiments. And
Yeah. I wonder, the counter argument might be we have multi-year procurement for various ship classes, and yet the shipyard still can't deliver these ships on time and on budget. But that may be something else lurking in the data there.
oh, that's fair. I mean,
Yeah.
I think that comes back to where we started, which
Yeah.
is the industrial
Exactly.
space.
Exactly.
I think, Mike, you made a great point. One of the things that the Department of Defense needs is the authorities that the other agencies have.
Yeah.
And one of the, I think the most interesting thing that the PPB Commission came out with a study, I think that Rand did, is identified all those areas where there's greater flexibility in the Department of Energy or the Department of HHS or whatever. And for some reason, we've taken DoD and handcuffed them so that they can't start innovative type of things. You know, again, we've kind of unilaterally disarmed through our budget process, and we just need to give those authorities to the Department of Defense and let them move.
And a final point on why the Fires Act failed, or 2 reasons it failed. And I devoted like year of my life to trying to pass this. So I failed. One, we got no support from the Department of Defense. Like here I am trying to give DoD more money to do interesting, creative things. This was like my Jerry Maguire moment. It's like, help me, help you. I think the comptroller wrote a letter saying, we're not interested in this. Like, thank you for your interest in national security. Go back to your hole in Longworth House office building. Like,
You'd have messed up the 5-year plan. Come
That's
on,
right.
You know, we've got certainty here.
That's
we're gonna,
right.
you know, we're you know.
But the other, and I love my appropriations colleagues, but I think it's fair to say that the appropriators didn't like it, and they viewed it as an erosion of their authority and ability to do year-on-year oversight of DoD. So
But I argue, you know, every one of those appropriators and every member of Congress bled for that money over the years.
Yeah.
And then for some reason, they don't. You know, they're not going to spend it, but they appropriated that money. They actually, you know, passed it. They put the political capital into it, and yet it goes wasted, or goes into the ether.
Right, that should hurt worse.
Yeah.
And I think this is a way in which we play to our like fundamental weakness as a country. Like our strength is inductive, iterative, you know, reacting to a reality. But then when we handcuff ourselves to think that we can think our way through it, that everything can be solved deductively and through a planning process. No one's saying don't start there, but to believe that you can lock yourself into it. And then, you know, as a consequence of that, we get to this point where I can't tell you how many general officers tell me something which feels like this shibboleth they keep repeating of, well, we've proven that we're not, you know, the best stewards of taxpayer capital.
You can't plan
we
everything.
deserve all this oversight.
Sometimes
But
you just got to
I'm not
get the
talking
data
about
and just
deserve.
mess
I wanna
with
talk
it
about outcomes. What do we need
and
to do
like
to
mess
win?
around for 2 weeks.
And, you know, if I need to
No plan.
First of all, I wouldn't even argue that we're that efficient. But if I need to tolerate the appearance of less efficiency to get more effectiveness, I think that's what the American people would vote for every single day.
yeah, I completely agree.
I think that's critical. The criteria for evaluating success should be value and mission effectiveness, and solving those bringing solutions to solve those problems. Instead, it's how did you spend the money, how did you meet the process, and it's all procedural, and how did you meet the 5-year plan. And that's essentially, you know, where we are. The problem, we need to focus on the changing the criteria for what is successful, and that's going to require leadership.
Absolutely. One other topic that I think is worth exploring is whether we've misunderstood what the capability is. When I look at Ukraine, you know, we spent 10 years of production in 10 weeks. It takes 8 years to produce a Patriot battery. The lead times and our ability, the responsiveness of this industrial, we forgot how to make Stingers. We had to bring people out of retirement to start spinning up factory lines. A consequence of the peace dividend is really getting into this mindset that we need minimal viable production capacity, that one day maybe with the press of a magic button you could somehow get more, but that what really mattered is we had the stock. You know, the stockpile was going to be the deterrent. But I've come to the conclusion that that's not the deterrent at all, especially when we see what happened in Ukraine. The deterrent is your ability to produce. And you should wake up every day saying, okay, how do I get 8 years down to 4 years? How do I get 4 years down to 4 months? You know, if you cannot produce at scale and quantity, if you cannot regenerate your weapon systems in the context of a battle, if you cannot threaten your enemy that I have years of weapons on hand, it's not worth picking a fight. You actually don't have deterrence.
Yeah, I think the producers would say, if we want to have that capability, like they still need to invest in the facilitization in order to be able to ramp up production. They need a consistent demand signal, right? If you want AMRAAM to go from 1,000 a year to 2,500 or 3,000, like you need to be confident that the global demand is there. And that's where I think it would be relatively easy via the FIRES Act and other mechanisms for DoD to solve that problem. And then you want to make sure that when you do the facilitization or build a new AMRAAM facility or LRASM facility or a modern facility in Japan or somewhere creative, like it is not built in the image of the past. It's a true like digital manufacturing environment.
Yes. Well, so I would say, like, as you well know, I think the only requirement is winning. If I get rid of requirements as a concept, I would. But the requirement should not be, this is what the LRASM will do. It's that you must be able to make 100 of them a month, 1,000 of them a month. That's the requirement. Now, that's going to force you to start designing for manufacturability. This is what I see as the biggest bug. When I work with my commercial customers, they don't even start designing things unless they understand the manufacturability implications of it. If they can't produce for scale, they're trying to optimize everything at the design time. In DoD, we optimize for how exquisite it is. Oh, it meets the specs of this requirement document, does all sorts of magical things. Never mind, I can only produce 10. I only realized I could make 10 of them after the fact. after you decided this is the right design. But if you said up front, no, I will never value the stockpile. In fact, I'm going to expend all these munitions, and I'm going to expend them with confidence, because what I'm valuing and what I'm buying and what I'm willing to pay for is the ability to produce them at a rate and quantity that scares the shit out of Xi.
This is because for a lot of reasons, but in DoD, the idea of the manufacturing, the production, the supply chain is all things that the department thinks of as back office. It has been separated from what we think of as warfighting capability. And we have got to connect these two ideas, because this is obviously something that's very near and dear to my heart. This is something we think about at Conveni all the time. And Mike, you said the right thing, which is this is very easy to overcome. There is data about all of this. There is data that the department does not look at around parts lead time, manufacturing capacity, latent manufacturing capacity, where it is in the commercial sector. And there is data that the commercial sector isn't looking at, or the industrial base, broadly, American industrial base, doesn't have access to, but it exists around the defense demand signal. And then there's this intermediary step that I think we should be mobilizing, which is getting companies that want to produce the warfighting capabilities at the platform level, the weapon system level, get them the demand signal, because they'll put the word out to all the suppliers who may or may not even know that their parts are ultimately ending up in DoD programs or weapon systems, and guarantee buys.
Yeah.
Guarantee buys. That gives you the certainty that's going to mobilize these companies to
Totally.
keep those production lines up and running. And all of this is known today. We have to think about the supply chain as part of the kill chain.
By the way, there's people I know that for a fact there's private capital that wants to get into the weapons buying game. They don't want to take delivery of the weapons, obviously, but there's a way in which you could creatively leverage private capital to satisfy the demand issue simultaneously. But again, if DoD was creative and flexible and had a consistent demand signal. The other area where I always think we have I think in terms of 2027, we can argue as to whether that's a real date, but it's useful framing, and we should take Xi Jinping seriously about wanting to take Taiwan by force. But so I think what can be done within a 2-year window. Well, one thing you could do is put advanced energetics into existing weapon systems and dramatically increase their range and lethality by 40% by some analysis.
Wow.
And that's it's not even new technology. It's technology we invented in the 1980s at China Lake that China stole and now uses in their weapons. And we still largely rely on an HMX suite of energetics. It's the easiest thing. You don't even create a new weapon. Just put it in an SM-6. By the way, we're no longer bound by the INF treaty when it comes to ground launch variants of some of these weapons. So then you can get really creative in the Indo-Pacific and really start to mess with the heads of PLA planners.
Well, thank you guys for joining me for this discussion here. I'm going to turn it over to each of us for some closing thoughts on this, and I'll close it out.
I think probably the most important point, and again, I commend your work, Sham, and would that we had other people willing to speak out and engage in a debate like this. But it all comes back to human beings, right? You highlighted some of the heretics. And there again, I think we have a situation where we've actually, Congress in this case, has provided a lot of authorities to the building on creative hiring, where we could start to bridge this gap between the commercial sector in general and the tech industry in particular and core DoD, but I don't have a sense that we're using those authority. And I went down this rabbit hole in chairing a cyber commission. Really, my ultimate conclusion was that as tech heavy and esoteric as any cyber discussion can be, it really is all about human beings at the end of the day. How do we get our best human beings in America and around the world, by the way, to be part of this creative process and to solve problems? And there, I think we have a huge opportunity for DoD to leverage the best talent out there. It's not easy, but we can do it.
I think that's so important. So I'm just going to yes end it. One of the aspects of that people problem is we have to make it easier for people to go in between private sector and public sector. The pendulum has swung so far to the extreme in terms of how difficult it is. It's going to bankrupt you to go back into government, and it's hard to leave because it's hard to go back. And so that is one area where we should see, again, pretty easy, I would argue, certainly achievable reforms that would help with that. To the point about the authorities that exist, there are so many authorities on the books today that give the department the ability to drive change here. There is plenty in the FAR and the DFARs that allow you to do everything we just described and do it at speed. It takes will. It takes will, it takes some risk taking, and it takes leadership. And I should have said this at the beginning, but thanks for inviting us here.
Yes.
It's good to be here, Sean.
The same, Sean. I really appreciate it. Agree with everything there. I think what I'm going to point out is just the need for the sense of urgency. Every conflict we've ever been in, we started unprepared, and it takes 18 months to 24 months to gear up to get to the production levels that we need. And we know these conflicts are coming. We need to start now. And when those conflicts happen, of course, existing authorities are used and new authorities are created and the system is end rounded. It's just time to do that now, because we probably don't even have 18 months based on current trends. And so we need to reestablish a sense of urgency. So I thank you for what you've done. As a fellow heretic, I hopefully we don't burn at the stake.
Well, thank you guys for joining me. I think that we're actually all in agreement that leadership is the crucial variable. This is not a tech problem. We don't need new laws from Congress. It's not an authorities problem. It's a will problem. And we need to galvanize around it. There's been a small group of people over the last 20 years banging their wooden spoons on pot and pans. And now I think that it's grown into a large group of people. The founders have shown up. The innovative parts of the American economy are ready to go rebuild that American industrial base. And we can only do it in partnership with the department. And so I hope the department receives these recommendations, Congress receives these ideas in the spirit in which it's meant to do, which is to prevent World War III. Yes. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Interesting. Very interesting. I think the things that I took away most from this was particularly around two things. The fact that we basically just let the government contract everything out. And with that, you don't have any competition to make things cheaper, right? It's basically saying, okay, we'll give you the contract. And with that, they can add on their cost associated with it and then their profit margin that they want to put on. And there's no real incentive to make things cheaper, right? And it gets back to this graphic that I shared briefly. Let me just make sure that I shut this down. Yeah, that's good that I shut that down because it was about to start blasting some gamer live stream. So let me share my screen here with respect to this. So this is a prime example, I think, of what they were talking about when it was specific around launch in space, right? You can see that things really were flat. Granted, this is a logarithmic scale, right? So, it's not linear, so keep that in mind. But you can see things were getting slightly cheaper over time, just as things got better. But at the end of the day, it really got exponentially cheaper, as you can see things dropping off like a rock here once Falcon 9 kind of came into play. So Falcon 9 itself initially was one of the cheapest to launch, and then you got Falcon Heavy and now Starship. And I would anticipate with synergies and continued innovation, this Falcon 9 might continue to come down and to the right, but it's just a prime example of one of the things that really can be done at a much cheaper and better pace. And I wouldn't be surprised there's so many other things like being able to build ammunition and being able to build ships that we've just lost that muscle in our world because we haven't necessarily need to flex it. The budget has just been always okay to increase. And I've seen this happen since early 2000s when I became conscious about annual budgets and stuff of the like, to the point where $1 trillion for an annual budget used to be insane. Like we used to be talking about billions of dollars for an annual budget. And now here we are, not even just talking about $1 billion anymore, but it's getting closer to $10 billion on an annual basis. It's just insane how expensive things have gotten. And, granted, yes, inflation does play a factor into that. So, of course, over time, things will change from hundreds of billions to trillions just on the fact that you have 2%, 3% inflation year over year. But when you think about the ability to go from hundreds of billions of dollars to a couple $1 trillion in terms of budget just within the matter of a couple years, like couple decades. Is just insane, right? I mean, inflation plays a factor, but not necessarily nearly to the impact. So the hope is that you'd have some sort of innovation. So like televisions, for example, are one of the few things that continue to get cheaper over time comparatively to something like education, healthcare, plenty of other things. Obviously, government spending when it comes to military defense. So I think people just need to recognize that if there's no way that things are getting slightly cheaper, there has to be some sort of reason as to why. And for Department of Defense, what I'm hearing from at least Sham and Mike Gallagher and all those folks that were on the call is that it's just a broken system. And so when you have a broken system like this, nobody's actually going to be able to fully comprehend where these costs are going. You don't have the right systems in place to manage cost increases. You don't have the right systems in place to get the appropriate bidding. To me, I think it's very evident that we get screwed over by contractors all the time. And at the end of the day, they just keep printing more and more money. So it's interesting. So I'd be curious to see how many other applications you could have comparable to that one with the launch space systems, right? With the Delta IV Heavy and all that now to the Falcon 9 and the Starship, etc. I'm curious what other avenues you could apply that towards. Shipbuilding, ammunition, tank building. I'd be really curious. What I think ends up happening is you'll pay a certain amount of money to get something kind of done, and next thing you know, they're just like, okay, well, now that we have it, we can kind of just sit on our laurels and get this contract out for millions of years. Like Lockheed, I know, will sell dozens of jets per year, and it's like, well, the cost of those jets never come down, and it seems to only go up. And it's like, well, we know how to build it. We should be able to figure out and innovate a way to make them cheaper over time. But instead, we raise the price over time. And granted, yes, some of these things get more complex. I have more intricate systems, AI involvement, and stuff of the like, but just confusing. Another piece that I think Sham hit the head on is sometimes you can't plan a lot of things. And I agree. Sometimes you literally, and I deal with this a lot at work as well. Sometimes you just need to legitimately set aside some space, set aside some space, get some real time to just digest data and throw a bunch of things against the wall and see what sticks. And so not everything needs to be planned out. Sometimes you just need to literally have research into defense technologies just be discovered, and you can't necessarily have a plan associated with these things. You can say, we're going to try X, Y, and Z. What happens, and you need to submit a piece of budget with it and know that some of it might just be lost, right? And sometimes you'll win and learn some things, and sometimes you won't. So Mike Gallagher said, like, if you have a $10 billion budget, you should celebrate if $1 billion basically went to a bunch of different failures, because at least you're trying to get things to stick to the wall once you're throwing them. And I agree. It's interesting to hear when certain companies will be like, we have a strict R&D budget. And it's kind of like a chicken and the egg situation, right? Because it's like sometimes when you just set like 20 billion, let's just say $20 billion for Google or something like that. You say $20 billion for R&D. That money's going to get spent, right? So it's like, for a fact, if you have a $20 billion budget, you're never going to give it back, right? So they're either going to do something with it. Things will magically cost more. There's going to be some sort of inefficiencies but if you're saying we only have X amount of budget, or everything needs to be approved, right? And, that's part of it as well. Having the right kind of systems in place to understand, like, everything that you do has a consequence. And not to say you can't spend it, right? But it's just like, okay, I'll release this amount of funds. I'll release, like, kind of like a construction project, right? It's like you're not just going to give somebody $20 billion up front to build a house. It's like you give a release, you have inspectors come, and after a certain amount of progress through the inspection process, you release the next 5% of funds or 10% of funds or something of the like. Instead, I think we just give these people $20 billion, we turn our head and just keep going about our lives. And next thing you know, they're coming back to like, ooh, actually, we need X, Y, and Z more. So anyway, I just think it's interesting with that respect. And you need to have like one of the best things that happened to 3M, like the sticky note and a lot of other products that actually ended up coming best out of 3M that ended up making the company a lot of money is, and Palantir does this very well, by the way, is they basically said, take either all Friday, like every other Friday, or like half the day on Friday, and decide and work on something, creating something that you want, right? Or that you would want to build in the company. And so that's how like post-it notes got made. That's how, for example, like I think it was the janitor was putting cayenne pepper or some sort of pepper on his Cheetos, and that's how hot fries and stuff got invented. Like stuff like that, where you're literally just throwing stuff out of nowhere and innovating. You can't put a budget really to innovation. So, sure. Oh, I was sleepy baby today. So there's a few things. There's those three things in there. You can't necessarily put a budget on innovation. Sometimes it's kind of has to be organic, and sometimes you will have to put some sort of budget to it, because like you can't just say, I don't know what we're gonna do, and then like you can't just be like, here's $20 billion for R&D without a real focus on it and really like understanding to a decent degree, how much people are going to be spending. And you also can't not have a budget. So it's like a chicken and the egg situation there. And then you also need to give yourself time to like decompress from delivering on certain things and just let your mind kind of wander in terms of being able to innovate and get things done. But it just seemed through this conversation, there's a lot of different problems out there that need to be resolved. And I think could end up having a fundamental shift in how we do things for the Department of Defense, as we've been sitting on our laurels, as we've seen over the past 30 years, really since the fall of the wall. So I'm very curious to see what ends up happening out of this. I don't necessarily know if it's going to be something as quickly fast-paced as maybe some might expect. But I anticipate there's going to be some sort of movement. And with that, I will close out the stream. Appreciate everybody sticking with me for an hour and 20 minutes or so. Hopefully you guys got a lot of enjoyment out of it, and hopefully we can check back in later on this. Yeah, people are always asking about the ticker symbols, right? I know this is a joke, right? So I don't... I'm not upset by that, but appreciate you guys. No, I do not have a slab. If anything, I have a nice Tahoe that I like driving, which I'm probably going to take myself to the Dutch Bros and give them some money. But for any of you guys that are interested, there's the white paper. I believe I posted that in the description. So if you guys want to take a little bit of time and read up the actual white paper, let me just double check that I put it in there. I thought I did. I have the Twitch link. Maybe I didn't, but while I have you guys here, if you guys could, if any of you guys, I know some of you guys are very much against Twitch, but if any of you guys do have a Twitch account, please do me a favor, humor me, and go over to there and at least just like it. If you feel so inclined, make an account. Follow me. I'm trying to get to 50 followers, and then I have another goal after that. But I'm slowly just trying to get myself to where I can multi-stream across multiple platforms. I've been streaming off of Twitch this entire time. You guys didn't even know. So it would really just help me out, even though I know that most of you guys want to view me on YouTube. That's fine. I'm not asking for any difference there. If you want to follow me on YouTube only, that's fine. But I just want to get the message across to everybody, and that's the goal. Just like you guys get this so much value through YouTube, I'm sure there's people on Twitch that don't even necessarily recognize the potential value that they can get. So through watching, me or others through Twitch. And so I just hope to bring that value towards people. And I just don't think there's enough financial education or just financial talk at all on Twitch. So hope you guys do well. I'll hopefully talk to you guys again when we potentially do Palantir Weekly tonight, unless Amit maybe sustains it. But I think tonight will be pretty important because we have earnings next week. So we'll see if they talk a little bit more about this defense reformation in the chat next week. But I can kind of understand, just based off what I'm seeing here, why it probably was excluded from the discussion next week. It seems like there's going to be like an ever evolving, I don't want to say lobbying sort of conversation, but it's more of like a long-term goal sort of thing, not necessarily a software release or anything of the like. So you guys rock. Much appreciated as always. And I will see you guys on the next one. Cheers. Meow.